Now got our employee data. We've got it available on our state as state.employees. And that's going to be an object containing all the different employees. So it's time to put together a list view. We've done this before, so we'll go through the implementation somewhat quickly. I'm inside of my employee list component, and for a list view, remember we have to make a DataSource object, and that DataSource object is going to require us to give it a method to say, here's how you render an individual row. So again, we've done this before. We're going to be doing the same exact thing again. First thing we'll do is up at React Native, we'll import the list view component. Then we can create a new data source inside of our component will mount right here. Now we haven't wired up the reducer to this component just yet, right? So we're not receiving that list of employees in here just yet, but we can imagine that we will have something like this.props.employees for a list of employees, right? That makes sense. So let's put together our code for creating our data source. Say const ds, remember this is all that data source stuff. And then we add in a row has changed. This is what detects whether or not, or basically the order in which all the records are going to be added in here. And then we'll assign our data source, which is going to be the source of data for the list. So ds.clone with rows, this.props.employees. Now there's just something a little bit funny about the code in here that we've got right now. Let's take a look at it. When the component is about to be rendered to our device, this component will mount will be called. We immediately tell our action creator to go fetch our list of employees. So the first time this thing is rendered to the device, we will definitely have no employees available, right? Like no employees have been loaded up yet. So as soon as we hit this action creator, we go to fetch the employees, which is an asynchronous request. So it takes like some number of milliseconds or some number of seconds to go and fetch that list of employees. But then the very next line of code, the very next instant, we immediately try to make access or make use of this.props.employees, which I'm going to expect, like it's going to be extremely likely that this.props.employees will be empty by the time we get to this line of code right here, because our actual request to fetch a list of employees is probably not going to be complete just yet. So because of this problem, I'm going to suggest that we do a little bit of a refactor. I want you to remember how Redux works, okay? Remember that anytime any piece of state updates, the connect helper at the bottom will rerun map state to props. And our component is going to get some new number of props, right? That like we pull off of our state object. So even though our component might not immediately have some value in this.props.employees, it eventually will. Like eventually we're going to get that list of data. Now we can get a handle on that value by adding in another lifecycle method called component will receive props. This is another lifecycle method that will be called whenever we are about to receive a new set of props to re-render the component with. So inside of here, we can again recreate our data source, assuming that, well, this time around we probably have access to our employees. What's really interesting about this component will receive props lifecycle method is that it gets called with the new set of props that the component is about to be fed. And it's captured as the first argument to the method. So it will be called with something that we, by convention, call next props. So inside of here, next props, let's just throw down a comment for it, are the next set of props that this component will be rendered with. And then this.props is still the old set of props. So we get access to both set of props inside of component will receive props. It's a nice little method for like reacting to any change in your props object. So we can move all of this creation code for creating our data source into this thing. And that might seem like the very obvious step here. That might seem like the very obvious strategy. However, well, maybe that's not entirely the right solution. I want you to think about one particular use case or one particular like flow throughout our application. Let's assume that the user logs into our application. We show the employee list component. As soon as we show it, we load up our list of employees. Okay, so like we load up the list of employees, eventually they get loaded, and then we call a component will receive props. So if we add all this code down in here, that will accommodate that solution, right, or that flow. But what would then happen if the user navigates over to like the employee creation form, right? This component will be unmounted, so it will not be shown anymore. The user goes over to employee create, they create their new employee, and then they come back to employee list. When a user goes to employee create, this component, it gets tossed out the window. It's gone. It gets thrown away. It gets garbaged. When the user navigates back here, they're going to be rendering a new instance of employee list. So we will hit our component will mount. We'll call the action creator again. But you know what? Like, we will fetch the new list of data, which is okay. But remember, we already have loaded up all of our employees, and they're still sitting in our global state object. So even though we could move all this code down into component will receive props, it was actually going to kind of benefit us if we make sure that we try to build our data source both when the component first loads up and when it receives new props. So the solution that we're going to go for here is I'm going to add another helper method in here called create data source. And then I'm going to expect this thing to be called with a props object. So like some props, whether it be next props or this.props, whatever it might be. So I expect that props object to have a property of employees. So I'm going to destructure it out of the arguments object. And then inside of here, I'm going to take all this list building stuff and I'm going to do it inside of create data source. Then instead of referencing this.props.employees, I can reference just employees. So now the end result of all this is that inside of my component will mount, I can call this dot create data source with this dot props. And inside of my lifecycle method, I can call this dot create data source with next props. So no matter where I'm coming to this component from, it doesn't matter. No matter what, I will always be attempting to create my data source, which is exactly the behavior I want to have. Cool. The last thing I want to point out here, I'm going to ask you to please double check your spelling on component will receive props. So make sure you got a lowercase I in here, and remember I before E except after C. So C-E-I-V-E props. Okay, I think that our data source is now going to be built up correctly. Let's continue working on our list in the next section.